call. Thank you everybody for coming to Adam's dissertation. So Adam, we realize this is your fourth year. He's finished this in 4 years. It's been an interesting project to work on, very timely. And so the way we do it, for some of you who don't know, is that Adam will be presenting his work. He's going to take about a half hour to 45 minutes, maybe an hour?
No, it's like 45
minutes. 45 minutes. And then what we do is we open the floor. His committee will first ask whatever questions they have, and then we open the floor to everyone, and then we ask everyone who's not on the committee to leave. We talk about Adam and his presentation, and then he'll come back. But I want to start off by saying that this is really Adam's project. I want to say this is Adam's idea. He did the data collection. He led a whole group of students. This was clearly his baby, for lack of a better word, in that I want to stress that Adam was very independent. He was a great student for doing this, and it was really sort of like working with a colleague in terms of working with Adam on this, and that he really took a leadership role and worked independently. So what you're seeing is Adam's big piece of work here, and everything that he's done, and my goal was really to facilitate. It was one of the easiest dissertation projects to do in terms of the person who was leading it, so I wanted to stress that here. So, but Adam, you can go ahead, and so we'll let you do your presentation. And if people do have questions, briefly, just for clarity, you can do that during the presentation. But details, you can ask detailed questions at the end.
All right. So again, thank you all for coming. The dissertation topic is on online aggression, the impacts of anonymity and social modeling on emerging adults. And my committee members again, Dr. Stevens, Dr. Eaton, Dr. Reeves-Sutherland, and Dr. Liu. So in the proposal, I mentioned the introduction and methods in more detail, so I'm not going to talk about that as much, but I do want to give a little background. So I'm going to talk about the online experience. I'm going to go into anonymity and privacy. I'm also going to talk about the other major construct of social modeling, emerging adults, which is the population that I studied, and religiosity, spirituality, political attitudes, the method, results, and discussion and conclusions. So the online experience, I'm going to stand so you can see, involves several different components. One is anonymity of the user, and I'm going to define anonymity in the next slide. But suffice it to say for now that this is essentially just situations in which your identity is concealed or removed completely. It also involves the absence of nonverbal communication, so things like hand gestures, facial expressions, body language. There's also a component of physical separation and this idea of temporal flexibility, which is this idea that time is sort of relative. You can complete a lot of different tasks. You can communicate with thousands of people all simultaneously on the internet. And some of the benefits of computer-mediated communication is, of course, you can communicate with people across extensive distances. There's virtual education, social modeling, social networking, and even text messaging with people across extensive distances. But unfortunately, computer-mediated communication can also be a vehicle for cyberbullying and for online aggression, of course. So when we think of the term anonymity, we're thinking of situations in which accountability for any behaviors you're engaging in are minimized or removed completely. But Hain and Rice in 2000, they discuss anonymity as social anonymity and technical anonymity. And social anonymity involves anonymity more in the abstract. So things like your personality, your voice, your body language, things that you can use to pin an identity to somebody. And concrete identity, or anonymity, refers to things that our society has defined as identifying information, like your first name, last name, your birthday, your address, your social security number, things like that. And on the internet, this involves both social anonymity and technical anonymity. So as I said before, there are some negative implications for anonymity. One is this phenomenon called cyber disinhibition. And cyber disinhibition is this increase in inappropriate and uncharacteristic behaviors online, and it's said to be due to the anonymous nature of the internet. So people can feel free to be whoever they want to be, say whatever they want to say, or do whatever they want to do, and at the end of the day, they can simply just log off without desire to return. In this particular study by Eastwick and Gardner, they made the term more popular, but they also studied different social phenomena that occur in face-to-face interaction that also occurs online. So they studied things like the foot in the door technique and the door in the face technique, which are techniques that people use in order to gain compliance. There's also another researcher by the name of Yi, and they focus on they focus on the idea of interpersonal space, so the amount of space that men tend to stand between each other when they're communicating, and the amount of eye gaze that they give each other versus females. And those similar findings that are found in face-to-face interaction also occur in virtual worlds. And one of the popular worlds that they use to measure this online is this game called Second Life. There's also there.com, but these are just games where essentially you can do whatever you can do in real life in these games. You can hold a job, you can have a family, you can go to school, make relationships, basically anything you can imagine you can do. So unfortunately, CMC is also a vehicle for cyberbullying. And cyberbullying is essentially just harassment through communication, through computer-mediated communication. And the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey in 2013 found that 15% of high school students, and even more, it occurs more in between the ages of, or the grades of 10th and 12th grade, that they have experienced some form of cyberbullying online. And also in this other study by Ibarra and Mitchell, 15% admit to having been an actual online aggressor themselves. This doesn't necessarily mean they're engaging in cyberbullying, but they engage in online aggression. And the study by Patchen and Hinduya in 2009, they actually mention some of the most negative effect of cyberbullying, which is that if people are cyberbullied to the point where they actually take their own lives. So this is the phenomenon that they call cyberbullicide. So it would be unfair if I didn't mention some of the positive effects of anonymity as well. So for individuals who have social anxiety, or individuals who may be part of a social group that is disparaged, or if they're just in help-seeking behavior or looking for advice, and they may not feel comfortable doing that in a face-to-face setting, they can be more likely to do this when they're anonymous online. And people who have social anxiety can report that their feelings of anxiety are lower, they have lower self-consciousness, and they use it to curb loneliness and to make friends when they're communicating online. Also in this other study by Fox and Dugan in 2013, and in the study by Griffiths and others in 2017, they use this thing called moderated open access internet support forums. And these are things that individuals are actually moderating these forums, so if there's any cyberbullying that occurs, they can actually remove these posts. So this is a better environment for individuals who are anonymous to interact in without the negative implications of online aggression. Now, the other main construct that I was studying is social modeling. And social modeling, essentially, when we think of that, we think of the Bandura, Ross, and Ross study, which is essentially there were adults placed in a room with a Bobo doll, and they would punch and kick the Bobo doll, and they would say things like bam or zip or zing. And the children would be watching this, and through observational learning, when they had a chance to interact with the Bobo doll themselves, they would mimic and eventually learn the same aggressive behavior. So it's this idea that exposure to aggressive models can inhibit our inclination to display normative behavior. And evidence for this also occurring in internet worlds is a study by Smith and Burge. And this doesn't necessarily look at aggressive social modeling, but just modeling in general and observational learning. So in this particular study, individuals engaged with avatars on Second Life, and they, before engaging in a new behavior that they weren't familiar with, or a new task or activity, they would actually shadow and engage in this lurking behavior. So they would observe other avatars first in order to see what they were supposed to do, and then they would, through observational learning, they would mimic it and eventually learn that behavior. So in my study, I'm looking at the combination of anonymity and social modeling and how these two constructs interact to influence our behavior online. And the population that I studied was emerging adulthood, and this is roughly from the ages of 18 to 25, but there's some literature that extends it to 27. And this is a time of identity exploration, instability, self-focus, this feeling of transition or in-between, and a time of possibility. And it's particularly important to study emerging adults for online aggression because, first of all, the Pew Research Center in 2015, they report that 90% of individuals between the ages of 18 and 29, so they extended a couple years, but they have experienced, sorry, I'm trying to move this. They use some form of social networking, or they use the internet. And also the U.S. Census Bureau in 2013 and then subsequent years after that report that 92% of individuals between the ages of 18 and 35, so they extended a little more, but contains the emerging adult population, they're exposed to the internet. They have a computer with access to the internet. So aside from just being the population that potentially can experience online aggression the most, this population is also in a period where they're solidifying their own worldviews, which might be different from their upbringing. So in the next couple of slides, when I talk about political attitudes and religiosity, it's particularly important to emerging adults because they're in a period where they're solidifying those worldviews, and it matters more in forming their own behaviors. Also, the autonomy that's afforded by anonymity on the internet is helpful to individuals who are experimenting with new behaviors, because using autonomy and using anonymity, you can feel free to be whoever you want to be or say whatever you want to say, and you can experiment and see what the social repercussions of that behavior would be before engaging in face-to-face interaction. So for the first exploratory question that I was looking at, this is political attitudes. And generally, it's the scale that I use is conservatism versus liberalism. So individuals who score higher on the scale are more conservative, individuals who score lower are more liberal. And this is particularly important, as I said, to emerging adults because they're in this period where they're evaluating different policies and they're trying to determine a partisan preference. There's also been some links to aggression, so this idea of political flaming, which is essentially just verbal harassment via computer-mediated communication. This is something that anybody can see if you go onto a news article that has some kind of political topic, especially now after the 2016 election. You can see one person posting one thing, and then it just gets extremely vulgar and aggressive after that. And it's just a slew of aggressive comments. And arguably, people wouldn't behave this way or in the same way face-to-face, as aggressively at least. And some of the links to aggression, so there's a lot of different research that focuses on how people who are more conservative in their political attitudes, they are more likely to endorse aggressive solutions to problems. So things like a hostage situation or a counterinsurgency campaign or a seizure of power, they're more likely to respond to that with aggressive tactics. Whereas liberals were more likely to engage in things like negotiation or some sort of diplomatic solutions or imposing sanctions or something that's not violent in nature. And for the other exploratory question of religiosity and spirituality, religiosity mainly refers to adherence to beliefs or practices or precepts of a particular religion, and spirituality not necessarily is rooted in that religion. So you could, for instance, denounce the Bible or just decide not to go to church at all, but still be someone who believes in God and a higher power and considers himself religious in nature. There's been mixed research on this, so some of the links between religiosity and spirituality and aggression, some studies say that, and it's usually the more extreme religions, people are more likely to endorse corporal punishment and capital punishment if they are more conservatively religious. So in this particular study, they look at Protestants who have high biblical literalness, and in the study on the bottom here, they're more likely, males who are Protestant and have a high biblical literalness are more likely to perpetrate domestic violence. Also, in the other study by Grasmick, Bursig, and Kimpel, they look at individuals who are extremely religious and have a high biblical literalness again, but they're more likely to endorse corporal punishment and the use of aggression in other aspects. But it's also, in other studies I didn't mention, there are individuals that study religiosity and spirituality, and people who have higher senses of both of those, or who score higher on that, are also more likely to promote nonviolent behavior in some particular studies, and they're also more likely to breed harmony among different groups. So this is why this particular question for religiosity and spirituality, we didn't know exactly what would happen in the results. So to briefly go over the method and procedure, there were 723 undergraduates. There was a little bit more, but some of them had to be thrown out because of some computer malfunctions. Maybe, I think it was 15 or something like that, but that happens. And every single participant who would come into the lab, they would complete this get to know you task. And if you were assigned to the anonymous condition, you were basically completing a modified version of that. But the get to know you task asks things like your first name, your last name, your major, where you typically hang out on campus. So things like that that would be able to pin an identity to that person. And also in the subsequent task for this, participants were going to be engaging in a public forum. It's a fake forum that they thought was real, that had either other comments or didn't have any comments at all. And if they were anonymous, they were told they were going to be posting under the guest username. So nobody was going to know who they were. None of the information they provide was going to be provided to any of the other participants. And all participants would listen to this recording of Donald Sterling's conversation, and this was the owner of the NBA Clippers team. I'm not sure if he's still the owner. This was 4 years ago. But this was a popular topic when I started the dissertation. And I was going to play a snippet of it, but I don't think it really matters to do that much. But just to suffice it to say, in this conversation, he is being racist against blacks and Hispanics, and he says some comments like, you can hang out with black people, don't bring them to my games. And he's basically, the entire time she's recording him, this is his mistress, and he has a wife as well, but he's being recorded and he's saying a lot of racist comments. So after they view this, or they listen to this audio recording, they enter the mock blog/forum with other users. And this is how I manipulated the social modeling conditions. So participants could have been assigned to the neutral posts, and this is neutral modeling, which here are some examples of that. I don't know if you can see it. It's kind of small. But so the first post says, I can see both sides of the debate. Everyone says or does something inappropriate at least once in his or her life. I bet if you recorded anyone's private conversations and make it public, you will always have people taking it the wrong way. So neutral posts. And these were posts that were selected by research assistants that were agreeing on the fact in front of all of us that this was either a neutral post or this was an aggressive post. And this is an example of if they were assigned to the aggressive modeling condition. And it's kind of hard to see it. But some examples, I mean, I'll read it just because. Why are most Jews so ugly? Blacks and Jews are non-white minorities. Both are in the same boat. Sterling was just telling the truth. Niggers are animals, and nobody wants to be around them. So these are actual aggressive posts that were taken from the YouTube comment section of this video. So, and even more vulgar posts actually exist, and it's sad to see that. But in the sense where people are anonymous and they have aggressive models, this can influence their behavior. And the third condition after the proposal, thanks to Dr. Eaton, was to add the no modeling condition. So in this condition, there was no post at all, and the participants were going to be the first ones on this public forum. So to discuss the two different results I had, one was an objective measure of aggression, the behavioral temptation scale on the bottom. And this is a modified version of the conflict tactics scale. So this asked participants questions such as, how tempted would you have been to smile at the other posters if you can interact with them in face-to-face? How tempted would you have been to insult or swear at them, to slap them, to make them feel at ease? A combination of positive and negative behaviors. And the verbal aggression in blog posts was something that was coded by 3 different research assistants, and the inter-rater reliability of this kappa value was 0.77, which suggests that they had good inter-rater agreement. This is essentially a correlation value. So if it was 1.0, all 3 research assistants would say every time that this post is aggressive, every single other research assistant would agree that that was an aggressive post, if it was perfect 1 correlation. And the way that the verbal aggression in the blog posts, here, I can show some examples first. So here's some examples of actual posts from some of the participants. So you can tell that they actually did take this seriously and they were engaging after listening to this audio recording. So, and particularly this one on the bottom, people can get also pretty aggressive as well. And here are some examples of some neutral posts. Well, maybe not neutral, but they were less aggressive posts. Okay. I can leave it up here for a second if you want to read. And you can stop me if I'm going too fast. And this is kind of hard to see, but this is the scoring sheet for the research assistants, and on the left side it got cut off. I guess there's a few columns missing. But on the left side they also coded not only if a post was aggressive, but the number of thoughts that were in each post and the number of those thoughts that were aggressive, which allowed for more granularity in the analysis, rather than just saying this entire 2-paragraph post is either aggressive 1 or no 0, because that would have been a little more difficult to compare things. So to go into the results, the first result I want to discuss is the behavioral temptation scale, and this particular scale only applied to individuals who were in the aggressive or neutral conditions, because it was how tempted you would have been to aggress or do these behaviors against the other posters. So you can see on the bottom here, there was no main effect for anonymity, and you can see anonymity is this column on the left, and people who are not anonymous is on the right. So there is somewhat of an effect you can see here, but this was not significant, between individuals who were anonymous and exposed to neutral models versus individuals who were not anonymous and exposed to neutral models. So they were slightly more aggressive when they were anonymous and exposed to neutral models, but that wasn't a significant effect. However, there was a significant main effect for the social modeling condition. So this bar at the top is the aggressive modeling. So when individuals are exposed to aggressive posts, they were more likely to respond on this behavioral temptation to aggress more aggressively. And my explanation for why anonymity wasn't really significant in here and didn't even interact with social modeling is because this is a measure that was in a scale. So this is not the same thing as actually posting openly on a forum. This is an objective measure that they weren't told that anyone else was going to be able to see this at all. This was just, in their mind, probably just for the researcher. So the scale is very different from when they actually posted on the forum, anonymously or not anonymously. So in this second analysis, this is using an ANOVA looking at the interaction between anonymity and social modeling, and this includes the no modeling condition. And this is when things actually get interesting with the results and how anonymity interacts. So first, there is no main effect for anonymity. There is obviously a main effect for social modeling, because social modeling was the most powerful effect in the study. But those main effects, or the one main effect, is qualified by a significant interaction between the social modeling and anonymity. So if you look just on the left side of the graph, these 3 dots, this is just all individuals who were anonymous. They were posting under the guest username. No identifying information was given to anybody. So when they were exposed to neutral models, they had a low number of aggressive thoughts in their posts. When they were exposed to no modeling, so there were no actual posts, they were the first ones to post, they had a little more aggression in their posts. And then when they were exposed to aggressive models, they were most aggressive in that side of the graph. Now the interaction is not between this variable, the neutral modeling. There was really no difference between whether you're anonymous or not. But when individuals were exposed to no models here, and they were not anonymous up here, they were most aggressive in comparison to all the other groups. And this is not significantly more aggressive than this condition, but this is a significant interaction between these two. So, and individuals were still, when they were exposed to aggressive models and they were not anonymous, they were still displaying a high number of mean aggressive thoughts in their posts. But the most aggression resulted when individuals were not anonymous and they were exposed to no models. And to explain that finding, I sampled from this idea of the social desirability bias. And essentially, when individuals are not anonymous, so everyone's going to know who they are, and they're posting on this public forum, they are trying to figure out the desirable way to respond. And they're all faced with this racist individual who's saying racist comments, and the appropriate behavioral response to that is to be aggressive against that target. So it does make sense that when they're not anonymous and they have no behavioral cues on what they're supposed to be doing, they can overcompensate and be more aggressive. And that's it seems like a pretty good explanation for this, and it's also in, I did a separate analysis just to see if that was, I don't have a mouse.
It's stated, yeah, you can see it on the
Yeah, I don't know why
screen.
it's on there. I guess I have to move it to one side. Oh, there it is. Okay, so of the 97 posts that were labeled as aggressive in the no modeling condition, 95% of them were aggressive towards Donald Sterling.
Right.
So it sort of solidifies that idea that it was social desirability responding, because the appropriate response is to be aggressive towards that racist target. Now the other options, they could have been aggressive towards the other case participants, or they also could have been aggressive towards groups of people. So in the other conditions, this is compared to the aggressive condition, where only 79% were aggressive towards Sterling, and 59% in the neutral modeling condition were aggressive towards Sterling. So in those other conditions where there was aggression present, they were not all aggressive towards Donald Sterling. They were aggressive towards other social groups, or they were aggressive towards the other case participants. Okay. Any questions about that one before I go on? No? Okay. Restart required. Okay, so for the exploratory hypothesis, or the exploratory question looking at political attitudes, what I did in this case is I did a multi-categorical hierarchical regression, and this essentially is using this process model from Andrew Hayes, from Preacher and Hayes in 2014, and it looks to see if political attitudes had a moderating influence on the number of aggressive thoughts in the blog posts. And so in this, I just put the neutral modeling, the no modeling, and the aggressive modeling, and the score for political attitudes. The 0 here is the mean of political attitudes, and then 1 standard deviation below the mean, and 2 standard deviations below the mean, and 1 and 2 standard deviations above the mean on the right side. So individuals who were scoring 2 standard deviations below the mean, as you get below the mean, you're more liberal in that case. And in this case, you're more conservative in your political attitudes. So interestingly, this is contrasting research on the political attitudes, that individuals who are more conservative are more likely to be aggressive. They're more likely to endorse aggressive solutions to problems. In my particular study, liberals were more likely to be aggressive and have higher number of aggressive thoughts. To explain this, there's some research from Greenberg, Solomon, and Pierzynski that talk about this idea of worldview threat. And worldview threat essentially is when you're placed in a situation where your worldviews are threatened, you're likely to respond with defensiveness and aggression. So it makes sense that when individuals are placed in this stimulus where there was a racist individual, which goes against liberal ideologies of equality and of acceptance of other people, it's a liberal angering stimulus. And individuals who are more liberal are more likely to be aggressive in their blog posts, which sort of makes sense that they were responding to that worldview threat.
Did you break this out by whether people were aggressive towards Sterling or other targets?
No, this one is just looking at the number of aggressive thoughts. It would be interesting to see that, though.
Right, that would provide further support for
The only thing is that for some of the modeling conditions, or for the no modeling condition, 95% of that was towards Sterling. But it would be interesting to break that apart to see the different targets of aggression.
I mean, you have a large N here, so even if you divided the no modeling condition into liberals and conservatives, you still might find a difference.
Right.
In the proportion of aggressive comments towards Sterling versus no.
And one of the issues with this scale is that, as you can see, the standard deviations are really low. But this is still, as this continues, if the graph were to continue out and you get to people who are more extremely conservative, it does continue in a linear trend. And if you continue at to more than 2 standard deviations below the mean, individuals who are most liberal, this similar trend continue into the most aggressive comments. On average, I mean, there were some comments where people were not completely liberal, or they might have been conservative and still had aggression, but on average, this works out. So in this case, political attitudes was a significant moderator. Now, when I look at the next graph of religiosity and spirituality, this is basically the opposite effect that we see. So this is, again, the mean, and 2 standard deviations below the mean, 2 standard deviations above the mean. And religiosity and spirituality combined together was a significant predictor, or was a significant moderator of the influence of social modeling on the number of aggressive thoughts. But in this case, individuals who were scoring higher on religiosity and spirituality were more likely to have aggression in their posts. But this effect is really small, and the standard deviations are very small, so the practical significance of that is not very high. But also in the studies in the literature that focuses on religiosity and spirituality leading to aggression, they mainly focus on extreme types of religiosity. So individuals who are extremely religious are more likely to be aggressive, but individuals who maybe spiritual, which is more likely what my scale actually tackled, they're not necessarily more likely to be aggressive in the literature. And also, the idea of the worldview threat could also be applying to this as well. So individuals who responded to similar questions like, I believe that we are all God's children, or things like that, that's a response that sort of promotes equality and acceptance of other people. So it does make sense that when they're presented with a racist individual, they're going to respond with this increased aggressiveness towards that target, because it also kind of ties into the worldview threat. So any questions on the results before I go on? Okay. So for some of the limitations, obviously there are limitations in this study, as there are in all research studies. The particular manipulation of anonymity that I used is sort of limiting. So I had individuals coming into an actual lab rather than being in the comfort of their own homes behind a computer screen, which is a very different type of anonymity. You can probably feel more comfortable engaging in specific behaviors when you know that nobody's going to know who you are. But I had people coming into a lab,
Right.
and it was an uncomfortable lab where they probably felt they were being observed. And it's very different from true anonymity in the natural environment. Also, the stimulus used, the Donald Sterling incident, at the time that I developed this study, this was a popular topic, and this was something that was occurring at the same time as I developed the study and as participants were coming in. But now it would have made sense, I think, if I did a different study, if I maybe focused on the 2016 election or Donald Trump being president, unfortunately. But it would have been a much more relevant topic to study now. And it's something that I would still even pursue in future research, to see different topics and how they affect individuals. Also, the population that I used, emerging adults in FIU, using the SONA system. Emerging adults probably respond differently to the manipulations that I had here. It would be interesting to see different populations, different age groups that might respond differently to worldview threat, for instance. They also might respond differently to the influences of anonymity and social modeling. But again, as I said before, the population of emerging adults is also a strength. So emerging adults are exposed to the internet the most. They're interacting with the internet the most, according to the Census Bureau and the Pew Research Center. And potentially they're also exposed to online aggression the most, because they're using the internet the most. And as I said before, it'd be interesting to see this idea of worldview threat and how it gave us different results for political attitudes being linked to aggression. People who are more liberal were more aggressive. It would be interesting to see how that worldview threat plays out in different situations, or maybe in a different stimulus where it's not something that's racially or politically charged, to see if anonymity and social modeling might play more of a role, and it would be easier to separate that if there wasn't a situation of worldview threat. And some of the future directions of this. So, methods to increase positive behavior in online environments. This study focused on online aggression, and obviously not all internet venues are full of aggression and addiction, and are obviously some benefits to anonymity and social modeling. In this particular study by Millen and Patterson, they recommend, in this case, which isn't necessarily a good idea, but exposing people's identities. So if you are exposing people's identities in an online environment, they're going to be more likely to be more amiable. They're not going to be as aggressive in that situation. But obviously this is something that you can't really ethically do in a lot of situations. You can't just expose everybody's information on the internet. And also in some environments, there's just no way to do this. And honestly, in a lot of different environments where anonymity exists, social modeling might be something that is more influential in people's behavior. So obviously in my study, social modeling was more influential than anonymity. So even in environments like Facebook and Twitter, where people know your name, you can still see an intense amount of aggression on there. So anonymity might not necessarily be the only solution to online aggression. Also, this idea that there's support structures to discuss social or personal or health issues. People who are anonymous can feel free to do this rather than having to do this in face-to-face interaction. Fox and Dugan in 2013 talk about that open access moderated internet support forums. And these are environments where there's moderators who are actually paid by whatever company's hosting the site, or whatever, even a video game or something. And they will actually have individuals sign some agreement. for instance, if you're entering a game, there's a term of service or term of use agreement that says that you're not going to be engaging in cyberbullying or online aggression, things like that. But if you do, there will be consequences. You can be suspended temporarily, and you can be eventually banned permanently from the game or from this posting service. Now, people can get around that and buy another copy of the game, but then they're going to go through the same process of being suspended and banned if they keep doing cyberbullying behavior. So, in conclusion, this study showed that anonymity and social modeling do moderate or do interact to influence online aggression, particularly in the second result that I showed with the 3 modeling conditions in anonymity and no anonymity. Also, as I said before, not all virtual environments are full of aggression and addiction. There's obviously some environments where people can feel free to engage in just because they're anonymous, but also display positive behavior and positive modeling. And it would be interesting to see in future studies to look at the influences of anonymity and social modeling in a positive sense. So there are some studies that do this already. There's a study by Pratt and others in 2014, and they look at the influence of positive or pro-social modeling on individuals who are interacting in a video game and also individuals interacting on a forum. So when people are exposed to positive social modeling online, in this particular study that they were talking about, they were more likely to engage in pro-social behavior following in the game and also in face-to-face interaction. And obviously other potential moderators that might influence online aggression are important to study because as all human behavior is multi-determined and heterogeneous, also online aggression is probably multi-determined and heterogeneous. And there's a lot of different moderating influences for online aggressive behavior. For instance, a couple studies actually look at this idea of emotional regulation and also things like states and traits that people may be experiencing. So if people are especially lonely or experiencing depression, that might influence how they interact on the internet at that particular moment. And there's a whole host of other moderators you could think of, like maybe people who have higher empathy are more likely to not be as aggressive on the internet because they can imagine what that bullying behavior would do to the other individuals. So that is the entire dissertation. So thank you. If you have questions, you can ask.
Okay, so what we do is we begin with his committee asking any questions, and we can go ahead and maybe Dr. Reed Southern, since you're right beside me.
I'm gonna pass.
Okay.
Because the one thing that I primarily brought up in your written document was the issue of, since one of the things that you collected was a diverse sample, and I had asked you to maybe comment or to think about, you know, possibly breaking it down by minority groups to see if there was any kind of influence, given that this is obviously a very charged topic.
Yeah, and I think there are some other scales that were measured in this study just for future research if I wanted to publish things with it. And one of the things was perceived discrimination and also perceived racism that occurs in the world. So that would be an important scale to actually include. I didn't analyze that for the dissertation.
But what about just looking, I mean, did you take that demographic?
Oh, looking
group?
at different ethnicities. No, I didn't do that in the study, but that is something that I can definitely do, and we discussed that if it was going to be
Because it's such a
published.
large sample.
But I think it was, which it was good, because we're glad you brought it up,
Yeah.
which was like an obvious thing we should, but I believe, wasn't it still like 70% Hispanic? Or you
Yeah.
the
I
sample
mean,
was-
it's still gonna be.
yeah, which is still unique, right,
Yeah.
Right.
yeah.
But definitely, when I try to publish this, I'm definitely going to be including more comparisons and more analysis, especially
And
looking
you could
at
probably get
different ethnicities.
many papers out of this data, so.
But I also think it was good that when you brought that up, which is like an obvious thing, is that it is, most of the research on this was from white populations, so that you're finding this even within a marginalized population, although we know it's unique in Miami,
Yeah.
it means a different thing around power, but it was an example like use around race, so we had talked about, so that was.
You may not have enough non-Hispanics to do a comparison within your study, but at least you can restrict your study to Hispanic identifying participants only and say this holds in this sample, right? So the patterns found in the overall sample hold within the Hispanic subsample. That would be important to know.
Right, and as far as like the paradigm that I use, it was very easy to conduct this study. You don't necessarily have to do it in the lab, so it would be interesting to see a comparison with a predominantly white university doing the same exact study, so you can make more comparisons across different ethnic groups.
Kind of related, did you control for race when you do the analysis?
No, I did not.
That would be another way to kind of address that problem. Does race matter? Because like some people who are, let's say minority, might be more enraged by the issues than like majority.
I think some of the additional analysis to break down for the number of regressive thoughts. Overall, I think there were 720 participants, but there weren't that many aggressive posts out of all of them. So I should look at it would be interesting to see the actual number of posts that were aggressive. I think it was something like 300 maybe, or maybe 400. In the no modeling condition alone, because I know that I did that, it was 97 posts that were aggressive. So if you can imagine for the other two modeling conditions, I think it was about 300 something posts out of the 700 people that were labeled as a whole, either aggressive or not, they were aggressive. So that might make it a little more difficult, but it would be interesting to see the breakdown of that.
But didn't you ultimately get more granularity in that? You didn't just look at aggressive versus not.
Right, because I did
level
the number of aggressive thoughts. Yeah, so when I actually was only looking at a 1 or 0 using a binary logistic regression for that, it really didn't matter so much because there were some posts that were either aggressive or not, and I wasn't actually looking at if the post was maybe some of them were even like 2 or 3 paragraphs long. If you just collapse all of that and just say it's aggressive, that doesn't give you as much granularity as actually saying, okay, there were 7 aggressive thoughts in this out of 15 thoughts in the whole post. So it made more sense to do that and take the mean number of aggressive thoughts in each post.
I just have a question about that. So you said you were taking the mean number of thoughts instead of like a percentage. I guess it's probably basically about the same thing.
It was similar. I think if I did the percentage and I did something like a chi-square analysis, it would have been difficult to compare the influence of the political attitudes and religiosity because I had to use a hierarchical regression for multi-categorical variables because I had 3 different levels of the social modeling, and then I also had anonymity, and then I had continuous political attitudes and continuous religiosity. So to do that with the number of regressive thoughts as percentage, it wouldn't have worked. I mean, I guess I probably could have done that way, but the mean seemed to be the best way to do it.
Congratulations first. Although this is not the time to call you a doctor yet, but this is I think this is really good because you have made it so far. You completed your dissertation and you made your presentation. So a small congratulations first. I find your dissertation really interesting, and I find it this is a much better version than we did the proposal.
Right.
You incorporated all the feedbacks and comments, and did a really good job. For me, coming from the communication side, I find your research or your study is really inspiring as well because I'm doing a study on the public discussion about mental illness issue. So it's like the stigmatizing attitudes when people are talking about mental illness, the stigmatizing attitudes and the support. So I think for your study it is an online aggression. But what if there are positive outcomes of the social modeling? If there are like anyone who is calling for going against this type of discrimination or the racist thoughts, and then if for future research, if there is anyone who is calling for this type of going against the discrimination, the thoughts, this type of thoughts, and then if we call it like a supportive way, and then one of the social modeling condition is the supportive condition, and then maybe this is a good way to see whether there are people who see the positive social modeling condition, whether they're a good outcomes or not. If yes, and then I think this will provide some good implication for this industry, for communication, for social networking use, or online bullying. I think this is a good implication because we know like not only the negative things happen on the internet or social networking sites, but also the positive if we can or if we do that and we may influence the others. So I think this is good implications as well. And but this idea just comes from your study. So your study is really inspiring. And when you talk about the potential moderators in the limitation, it just comes to me there could be one more, or there of course there will be more, there are a lot more, but one possible moderators that is highly related to this concept, particularly the anonymous or the non-anonymous settings of the online enrollment, is the self-presentational concern. So if they have like strong self-presentational concern, and of course even they're like in the neutral modeling, if they have strong presentational concern, they want the others to know like what, I'm totally against whatever Sterling is talking about. I hate this, and he or she wants the people to know where he or she stands, and he or she tend to use a more aggressive or more extreme way or more emotional way, or to kind of express it, and then she or he can get the people's attention, and then his or her self-presentation or the public image will be more positive. So I think this could be possible explanation for why you have such a result, and this could be a possible moderator for your future research. This is all I can think of, but overall this is a really good one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean,
Get the whip out.
All right, so we're gonna play with ideas, right? I mean, this is your dissertation defense.
Sure.
It's not a cakewalk,
of course.
but I know you're prepared. So let's see. So I think for publication, I have a couple of recommendations for when you publish this. Start there. One is I think you're going to want to break down all your interactions by whether the aggressive posts were pro or anti-Sterling. The three-way, for example, may only hold for liberals who are anti-Sterling. So just like you did with the two-way interaction, you want to break down the three ways by aggression. You have enough N to do that.
Right.
So I also I'm not so sure about using the religion spirituality moderator in a publication. Fine for the dissertation, but I see some problems with it. Do you see any problems with the scale, the interpretation?
The particular scale, so there's a lot of studies that focus on religiosity or spirituality separately, but there's a lot of research that also focuses on, because they have a lot of overlapping definitions, it's sometimes beneficial to combine them in the purpose of studying it. But I think it's, first of all, in the results that I had for religiosity and spirituality, the standard deviation was, the amount of standard deviations below and above the mean, it was almost meaningless. But it was still a significant trend, so there might be something there, but it would be interesting to look at the actual spread of scores, so the range of scores. I don't think the scores ranged very far away from the mean, which was sort of close to a 3 out of the 5 on the scale. There wasn't like a no response choice, so they either had to be somewhat agreeing or disagreeing with the statement. I actually know it was 5. I think it was 5, a scale of 5. Yeah, so maybe there was, because if there was 2 and then 2 below, there might have been a neutral post. I have to look back at that, but yeah, I think just because the practical significance of the scale included in my study was really low, even though it was significant, I don't really think it was as meaningful as the political attitudes, for instance. But yeah, it might have been interesting to actually take a scale that only focused on religiosity or only focused on spirituality, and instead of combining the two, it might have produced better results for the study.
So the variability issue is not even one that I was thinking of, but yeah, if there's low variability, then maybe it's not going to be a powerful predictor.
Right.
It
For
was
the
a
actual
significant
questions.
predictor, but it's the actual questions, the
Yeah.
fact that religion and spirituality are so confounded in this measure, especially when trying to interpret the results. It's sort of like hard to do.
Yeah. I mean,
You don't know if this is how religious people behave, how spiritual people behave. Is this how people who are both high in religion and spirituality behave? And even the questions, like you were saying, some of them seem sort of liberal, like we're all God's children, and so that might produce a strong, aggressive, anti-racist response. But if we're all God's children, maybe you see Sterling as one of God's children. Why not bring him back into the fold?
Right.
You know, he's a lost lamb, whatever. I think it's really hard to know what to make of the findings.
Right, and I think something I could do if I wanted to publish something with that included, I mean, I can also take it out, but to include that, there's, I can look at how individual questions within that scale were responded to.
But
So
even the individual questions, I mean, I believe that one of them was, I believe how I act in this life determines what happens to me after. Is that spiritual or religious?
Right.
I mean, a lot of them are that way. I believe in a higher power. That could be anything.
Yeah.
I think they are confounded in real life.
Right.
People who are religious probably also see themselves as highly spiritual, but there are ways to tease them apart. The biblical literalness is one, and that's the result that's been, it's a measure that's been used so much in past research for a reason, because it's really about religion. Right?
I mean, because when I was forming that scale, just a lot sampling different research, I came across a lot of studies that said that it was beneficial to combine them because they are so confounded and there's a lot of overlap.
But then how do you interpret the results?
Yeah, it's tough. And I mean, this even showed that it was kind of tough to interpret the results.
If you were using it as a control or something, maybe.
Right.
So, and I don't think you lose anything in putting this together for a publication by taking that out. In fact, I think it cleans things up a little,
That might be
and you
better.
can focus on the moderating effect of liberalism versus conservatism, which is a cleaner measure.
Right. I agree.
So let me ask you, if you had an infinite amount of time and money, infinite,
Is there like an NIH or NSF grant you're talking about?
with an infinite amount of money
Okay.
and time, what would you do how would you run this study differently?
That's a really good question. I think the main thing that I posed as a limitation was the manipulation of anonymity. And it was a really weak, in my opinion, manipulation of anonymity because I had to do it in a lab setting. I had to have people come in so they can listen to this audio, but if I had an unlimited amount of money and resources, you could actually do this in virtual gaming environments. So if we had research confederates who made an avatar in a game like Second Life or something like that, and there was some way to actually manipulate the people who are anonymous or not, I don't know how you would actually do that because you can't just say that some of these people are going to be, their identities are going to be revealed. But at least you can study how things happen in a real anonymous environment. And being able to see how true anonymity influences aggressive behavior would be something that is tough to do. And if I had unlimited resources and there was a way to do it, I would definitely want to do that. Also the social modeling component. I think in gaming worlds, like whenever I think of true anonymity, I do think of internet gaming worlds rather than posts on a forum, because I feel like people can be identified still somehow, and that often happens like with the recent things that happened in Charlottesville. So I mean, these were just pictures of people, but then people found Facebook profiles and they released it all over the internet. So when you're in a game world and you have an avatar, nobody really knows who you are. You're just this figure. And you have a fake name, and that's true anonymity, I think. And so to have manipulations where you can have aggressive models and positive models and even just no models at all in that environment, you can really get an idea of what would happen with online aggression more accurately, I think. Which, I mean, I was still able to do it in a lab setting, but it's not as realistic as a virtual environment.
Right, so you mentioned that having someone log in as a guest, I think the terms in the dissertation was, it's not authentic and pure anonymity. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I think I see where you're going.
Oh, so when people were anonymous, they were told that they were going to be posting under the guest username.
Yeah.
A guest username was just guest and a bunch of numbers. And the difference between that and the not anonymous group is that those people, they provided things like first name, last name, and they were told that all of that information was going to be available on their post.
Right.
So they didn't actually get to see in live what their post looked like after they posted it. It was just hitting enter on this button, it's going to be added to this forum. Some people might not have even believed that that was happening. They were still obviously getting into the posts, so it did seem like they thought it was real. But the way that that's different from true anonymity is kind of what I discussed with the gaming environment, that if you're just posting under a guest username, you might have like an avatar that or a profile picture or something like that, and people can still use that to identify you. And also because people were coming into a lab, even if they were told you're going to be anonymous, you're going to be posting under a guest username, they still know that there's a research assistant outside who is potentially watching, and then they're going to have to report to them after. So that's not the same thing as being in the comfort of your own home, away from all other individuals, and behind a computer screen under a guest username. It's different to be just under a guest username in a room with other people watching outside,
And
I think.
I have to say, because I get this with my studies all the time, is these students are trying to figure out what you really want from them, right? Or what, you know, so whenever you post this, they're like, I'm like, for aggression, maybe I think they want me to be as aggressive as possible because this is obviously very horrible, right? So like, but if you had something that was a little bit, like you could log in from home and do it, and you don't have anyone really knowing who you are, probably would get more of an accurate.
Would you get more
estimation.
subtle results?
Maybe.
More subtle results from having people at home. I wouldn't know how I would manipulate anonymity if they were at home, because they would just all be anonymous. I think it would be. I mean, unless I can ask them personal information. And
Right. That's what
make
you
sure
did.
that
Yeah.
they
So
do
you
that.
would. Upload a picture of yourself. You know,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, that would definitely be ideal, and it's something that it could be done too. It's just.
Yeah, but you know how to do it all in Qualtrics.
Yeah.
Setting this up was a nightmare, so.
Yeah.
But also the IRB, there was.
Well, the IRB was tough. I had to actually meet with the person who's in charge of the review board here. I don't remember his name.
Chris Grayson.
Chris Grayson?
Yeah.
Just to see what you can do, because for manipulating anonymity as a variable, usually people are doing a study and they're supposed to be anonymous. And all the responses you provide are going to be anonymous and yada, yada, yada. But this actual construct was manipulating anonymity. And I asked if it's possible that I can ask their first and last name, and I can ask other personal identifying information. And he did say that that's okay to do in the IRB, but you also cannot be releasing this, of course, and it has to be deleted after the public. So I'm not going to be saving first names and last
And
names.
wasn't part of that, that's why we had to do it in the lab, was because we had to debrief.
Yeah,
So that was the other piece. That's why you
a
couldn't.
tough part.
It was because that was the whole reason they had to come to the lab, was because we had to have RAs to collect this, because as soon as they were finished, they had to be debriefed, and I'm not sure it would be enough to debrief with a video. You know, at the end, that's where infinite amounts of money would be great, because then you can somebody can call as soon as you're finished on the phone or something like that. You know?
Yeah, because so when I met with him, that was actually the biggest concern of his, is that you're going to be debriefing the participants adequately. So the debriefing script that I had to write went through like a couple back and forths with the IRB, and then it also wasn't something that you can just give them a slip and say, here's the debriefing form, read this. No one's going to read that. So you actually had to have the research assistant or myself, if I was doing some of them, to debrief the participant and tell them you were not actually posting on a real forum. This was just a forum for the research assistants and for the researcher. Even though we said that you were not anonymous and all that information was revealed, it didn't matter because we weren't giving this to real people. It was just for the purposes of the study. So we had to give them a whole like page-long debriefing script every time. But it's still possible to do that.
Yeah, with infinite amounts of money, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to see where you would go with
You
that.
can have like a live chat that connects to the researcher after.
Yeah, I think, again, for publication, in the discussion section, you may want to talk about how your study is evidence of what can happen, not necessarily what does typically happen, right? Using MOOCs in defense of external invalidity, right? So yeah, in when people are using these games, they choose to be anonymous or not, right? They're selecting in or out. They have different levels of anonymity. They're not in a lab where they're also potentially monitored. So, you know, I think this is sort of a proof of concept type thing rather than, and this applies to all online studies everywhere, right? So just make sure.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things I did want to specify a lot more when I do try to get this published is obviously that this is not, as you said, the response that happens all the time, that people are online or aggressive online, but also some of the benefits of being in a situation where you're anonymous, and even if you're still exposed to aggressive models, what would be a factor that makes you choose not to be aggressive in that environment? So I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be just publishing the dissertation as it is, but maybe doing more analysis and collecting more data that includes other things, so I can see how positive models influence people, like you said, also, and also just looking at environment or reasons why, maybe some analysis that shows even if you're faced with anonymity and aggression and you choose not to be aggressive, what are the chances of that happening, and why does it happen?
Did you look at gender at all?
No, it did not.
I'd love to know, just because
I did make sure that
prevailing narrative is men are more aggressive, but actually women in certain circumstances express more verbal aggression than men, and then we have a situation where there's a woman victim taping this man. So it'd be
I have
enough data.
I have a bunch of pivot tables that actually breaks it up by male and female. Just when I was like looking, I remember like in a couple meetings that we had, I showed you some of that. But I did try to make sure that there were an equal number of males and females in each condition. So that was one of the reasons why when I opened it up for the no modeling condition, it had to run for a couple semesters because mostly females were signing up. Because the population was mostly intro to psych classes because it was courses where you can get SONA credit, I guess. So they sign up through the SONA system online, and it's mostly psych students, which mostly females.
I think it's 65% female, 35% male.
more,
Really? Okay.
at least in who I've gotten in my studies.
Oh yeah, there were several times we had to close the study off for females, so no females can sign up at this point, only males, just to get an equal number in each condition. So that was a bit of a challenge, but that just made it take longer to collect data. But.
So what other measures do you have that you could look at individual differences, like why when somebody is anonymous and you know has this aggressive model, like, and they don't post something that's aggressive, like what other, besides the liberalism and the...
There's one study that looks at this, they look at emotional regulation and empathy. So they don't include other things like anonymity and social modeling, but they do show that people who score higher on empathy were less likely to be aggressive, and they were more likely to engage in pro-social behavior. Also, when people were exposed to positive social models, and they scored high in empathy, they were more likely to be mimicking that behavior when they had a chance to, and even in face-to-face interactions.
I think what you're asking is what other measures.
What measures do you have?
The measures
do I have any?
Do you have any that
I wish I had something like empathy, but I do have mindfulness, which is a measure from Kirk Warren Brown in Virginia, and that's something kind of interesting, but it doesn't. I don't think it tackles empathy as much, but it tackles how mindful you are of your behaviors and your processes going on and how it impacts other people. So it's similar, but no, if I had thought about this at the time, I would have included some sort of measure of empathy, just because I didn't even see this until writing the discussion of how empathy influences people being aggressive on the internet. But
I wonder if there's in your some of your scales, there might be some questions that kind of dabble along. That you might want to think about and focus on, and just as an exploratory to think about it for maybe a future study or to possibly.
I think in now you say the religiosity asks questions about other people, your your interactions, but not religious spirituality.
Yeah, that scale has a few. Also, I think the conservatism and liberal scale has a couple items like that, but then there might be a few in I had the perceived discrimination, and that might have some questions as well. It would be interesting to like maybe combine one and make like a composite score, and then test it for the reliability of each question. But yeah, so there's definitely more data that I have in there that wasn't used in the dissertation that can be used in future publications.
Which was an ongoing discussion of what to include, but we're trying to keep it
Right.
focused. So
Well, it
we're,
has to be shorter.
right,
but,
so,
I mean, it's-
yeah. So Dr. you have-
I'm done.
Okay,
I mean, I have
mine-
some little things I'll tell you, like APA style.
okay.
Very
So,
little.
which is more like building on what Dr. Eaton did, which we kind of talked about, was given if you got to, you said of infinite amounts of money, and I remember when this happened, there was a big discussion of that this was the case. There was also the man who shot the boys up in Atlanta, in Jackson. We were
Yeah.
debating about that one.
I don't
And all
remember
those things
his
seem
name.
so big now, then, that now they
Right.
seem so little. Like Donald Sterling now is like, oh, that's such
Least
a
of our
minor
worries.
case, right? And so this is what Adam and I would spend our things talking about.
Right.
So if you were, and we kind of talked about it, and you don't have infinite amounts of money, but we were talking about doing this in a year, beyond the measures, what would be another thing that you would want to look at? And what would be, and that would be relevant. And I'm not just saying, oh, Donald Trump, but
Yeah, I
what
mean,
would be relevant in terms of giving us new information for the field and maybe a case or something?
I mean, definitely, I think, though, when studying political attitudes and how it influences these things, obviously the 2016 election
Right.
it's not only something that was so significant, but also it's making more people get involved
Right.
who were not as involved in politics previously. So it does seem like it's a more relevant topic to be studying and seeing how individuals interact on the internet in response to that. I think it's something that even changed the way online aggression is displayed, because online aggression was displayed in video games and other things like that. In video games it's mostly displayed of like you're being bad at this game and they're talking about your skill level in the game. but now, I mean, I play games so I can still see this. Now people talk about things like, oh, you're probably a Trump supporter, or you're probably, you're probably a liberal snowflake or something.
Right.
And they say this in games where it's not even
Relevant.
really relevant anymore. But it's something that did, I think, shape the way online aggression happens now. And so I think, I mean, even though it's an obvious
Right.
topic to choose, I would definitely want to have changed the stimulus to something like that. And something that's not just used maybe as a stimulus, but even a manipulation. So with that idea of worldview threat and how people who are experiencing worldview threat are more defensive and they respond with aggression, it would be interesting to see situations where there is worldview threat and situations where there isn't worldview threat, and separating the two to see how people respond with those other constructs. Can't think of something else for that, but
Yeah, that's why I just want to see the application, thinking about it. We've talked a lot about this already, so I'll open the floor. Other questions people have?
So how long is your dissertation data collection? Is it a span over a couple of years?
how long did it take to collect it?
Yeah, from the first participant
It was
to the
probably
last.
a couple of years, just because it had to be in the semesters where there were students applied. I couldn't be doing it when there wasn't classes.
Right.
And also the main problem was when I had to close it off for males only. Sometimes I would get 3 people signing up for a time slot, and then 2 people would cancel, and there'd be 1 person there, or everybody would cancel, and then there would be nobody in the time slot. So it took more semesters than I thought it would.
Yes, and then one of my questions would be that, have you considered the effect of timing? Because when the video first came
Right.
out,
Right.
people might be more familiar with the issues, and there might already be some social modeling going on
True.
the internet when they're exposed to it.
And there is a way of looking at that, I think, because in Qualtrics it shows you the times
yeah.
that they completed it. So I do have the data, so I can actually look at that and see if that had an effect.
Would you see more aggression when the
Right.
video first came
Came
out,
out,
or maybe
Right.
around like 2016 election,
Right.
they kind of prime people to.
And I mean, I would argue that to control for that, everybody did see the video though in the study, so everybody was
It was
exposed
fresh.
to it. So it was fresh when they just heard it and then they got to respond
But
to it.
some
But
might have more exposure than the
right,
others.
that's true.
But I also think, I remember when it took, it was still, to get to the IRB, from the time it was approved, it was almost some like kind of old, not news.
Oh
Was
yeah,
it?
yeah.
But because of the IRB.
Right.
By the time he got it out, it was probably, it wasn't like in the news. I know what you're saying, at the time
Yeah.
everything was in the
Yeah.
news.
Mhm.
It wasn't as big in the news
Mhm.
at the time you started collecting the data.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that like a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot of people, maybe like 4 or 5 posts that I read when going through it, they actually referred to the guy as Donald Trump
Yeah.
instead of Donald Sterling.
Yeah.
Especially around the time of
Right,
the election,
exactly.
there are more
That
and
might have
more
changed
news
things.
like that coming out, so that might already.
I don't know if
kind of
maybe they
prime-
thought he looked like Trump or they just started thinking about it, but yeah.
But that might might be a benefit of doing something of Trump, because everybody knows about Trump, there'll be
Yeah.
something he'll say that you can put up next that'll still be useful.
Oh, and there's
to
something
do it.
every minute.
Yeah.
Right, so I'm saying, like, even if, it doesn't matter, everybody's been exposed to him,
Yeah.
so whatever he says won't be, you'll already have your attitude built around him, because we already know. Well, Donald Sterling was a sudden, this is the first time I heard Donald.